I didn't mind being an intern. I minded being called the intern like it was my name. They did it with the same tone people use when they pat a dog's head. Friendly, casual, and just humiliating enough to remind you where you stand. And the worst part was how deliberate it felt. They waited until a director walked into the room, until a vendor was on the call, until someone important could hear it. Let the intern grab notes. Ask the intern to send it. Hey, intern, nice of you to join us. I smiled through it because that's what you do when you're trying to get hired. But on the Monday, it finally snapped for me. My manager looked straight at my badge. He knew my name and still said, "Intern, you own the agenda today, right?" He leaned back like he'd scored a point. People laughed politely. Nobody wanted to be the one who made it awkward. I nodded, opened my laptop, and played along. Because I did own the agenda. And by the end of that week, I was going to put one item on it that would force everyone in that room to stop laughing. Not a tantrum, not a rant, just a question that had a paper trail behind it. And if my manager answered it the way I knew he wouldn't make it to the next stand-up. I was a career switcher, not some wide-eyed college kid. Early 30s, former military, then business school. I took the internship because I needed a clean entry into healthcare software operations, and the company promised a clear path to full-time if I proved myself. The team was small, operations, compliance, adjacent work, vendor onboarding, internal controls, the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff that never gets applause but always gets blame. My manager, Dylan, was the kind of guy who collected authority the way other people collect sneakers, not because he was good at the work, because he was good at looking like he owned it. He didn't train, he delegated, he didn't solve, he narrated, and he loved having an intern on the team because it gave him someone he could order around without pushback. At first, I told myself I could outwork it, keep my head down, deliver clean results, earn respect. Then I started noticing a pattern. Whenever something went right, Dylan used we. Whenever something went wrong, Dylan used names. And my name, when he bothered to use one, was always the same. Intern. It wasn't only the word, it was what came with it. He'd assigned me ownership of vendor onboarding tasks, but keep himself as the visible point of contact in meetings. He'd ask me to draft the process notes, then present them as if he'd designed the workflow. He'd have me chase signatures and approvals, then tell leadership I pushed it through. And every time I tried to speak up, he'd cut me off with a grin. "Appreciate the enthusiasm, intern. Let's not overcomplicate it." I learned quickly that arguing in meetings wasn't power. Documentation was. So I started keeping receipts the way you do when you can feel the ground shifting under your feet. Not emotional receipts, operational ones, dates, attendees, decisions, who requested what, who approved what, who told me to do what and when. It felt paranoid until the first time it saved me. A vendor rep emailed Dylan asking why onboarding was taking so long and why we needed so many steps. Dylan forwarded it to me with one line: handle, keep them happy. So I replied with the policy language, calmly explaining the sequence and timelines. The vendor backed off immediately. Dylan saw the reply and said in front of the whole team, "See? The intern is good for something." Everyone chuckled. I didn't. Because what I heard was, you're useful until you're inconvenient. The real trigger started as a routine project, onboarding a third-party billing vendor for a new integration. This wasn't some minor tool. This vendor would touch regulated data, meaning audits weren't hypothetical. They were guaranteed. The onboarding requirements were strict for a reason. Background checks, access controls, audit logging, separation of duties, final compliance sign-off before any production credentials were issued. The company had a written process, a boring, formal PDF most people treated like a museum exhibit. Dylan treated it like a suggestion. The CFO wanted the integration live by end of quarter. The vendor's sales team wanted momentum. Dylan wanted to be the guy who made it happen. So the pressure rolled downhill. First, Dylan asked me to pre-stage access before final sign-off. I said we couldn't. The vendor had to wait. He smiled like I'd told him the weather was illegal. Intern, he said, compliance is flexible when leadership says it is. That sentence was the moment I stopped thinking of Dylan as annoying and started thinking of him as dangerous. Because flexible is how you end up in front of internal audit with no answers. And I could already see the escape route he'd take if anything went wrong. Point at me. The intern handled onboarding, so that night, after everyone left, I opened the policy PDF and read it top to bottom. Slowly, like it mattered, because it did. And buried in the middle was a line that made my stomach drop. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It was just a control. Any bypass of onboarding controls required a documented exception approved by legal and compliance, and disclosed to internal audit at the next controls review. In other words, if Dylan wanted to skip steps, he could. But he needed written approval. And once he did it, the bypass didn't stay secret. It had to be reported. That's the kind of clause that separates aggressive leadership from career-ending mistake. I printed the page. I highlighted the sentence. Then I drafted an email to Dylan that was so neutral, it almost hurt. I attached the excerpt, and I wrote, "To proceed early, we need an exception form signed by legal and compliance. Otherwise, we must wait for standard approvals." I stared at the screen for a long time before I hit send, because I knew what would happen next. Dylan didn't like being told no. He didn't like being slowed down, and he definitely didn't like being corrected by someone he'd been calling the intern in front of directors. But I needed him to respond, not for revenge, for protection. Because if he insisted on bypassing controls, I wanted one thing: proof that it was his decision, not mine. His reply came fast. "Proceed. I'm approving. Do not slow this down. No exception form. No legal, no compliance. Just a confident order from a manager who thought confidence was the same thing as authority." I didn't argue. I didn't reply with emotion. I didn't threaten. I saved it. I exported it as a PDF. I forwarded it to my work archive folder that logged every message. Then I did something that surprised even me. I opened the agenda template for our Friday operations meeting, the one Dylan had just mocked me about, and I added a single line item at the bottom: vendor onboarding control exception confirmation. I sat there in the empty office, staring at that sentence, feeling my pulse in my throat, because I understood the real game now. I wasn't going to tell on him. I wasn't going to create drama. I was going to ask one clean question in the right room, with the right people present, using the language the company actually respected. And if Dylan tried to laugh it off the way he always did, he'd do it on record. I shut my laptop, turned off my desk lamp, and walked out into the parking lot with a strange calm. They could keep calling me the intern. On Friday, I was going to remind them what happens when you underestimate the person holding the paperwork. By Friday morning, I'd convinced myself I was being dramatic. That's what they teach you in corporate life. If you're the lowest title in the room, any discomfort you feel must be your own sensitivity. Any boundary you draw must be immaturity. Any fear you have must be overthinking. So I told myself I'd ask the question. Dylan would grumble. Maybe Mara would tell him to get the exception form signed, and that would be it. Clean. Professional. No fireworks. But the week didn't let me keep that fantasy, because Dylan didn't just ignore the policy. He started moving like he knew I had pushed back, and he wanted to remind me who got punished for it. It was subtle at first. He stopped copying me on threads I needed to do the work. Then he complained that I wasn't proactive. He began assigning last-minute tasks at the end of the day, then messaging me at night, asking why they weren't done yet. And in every meeting, without fail, he said intern like a little slap. It wasn't about the word anymore. It was about conditioning the room to see me as disposable. So if anything blew up, the blast would land on me. That's when my irritation turned into something sharper, because I realized the unfairness wasn't accidental. It was infrastructure, and he was building it around me. But that was just the beginning. On Wednesday, the vendor requested production credentials early. They phrased it politely, but it was still a push. We want to validate configuration in the live environment as soon as possible to meet the target timeline. Dylan forwarded it to me with a single line: make it happen. No discussion, no plan, no exception paperwork. I replied the way I'd practiced: calm, neutral, policy-based. I attached the excerpt again and asked whether legal and compliance had signed the exception form. His response came back almost immediately. Stop hiding behind process. You're slowing us down. I said, proceed. Then, because he couldn't resist performing, he added, also, when you talk to the vendor, don't make it sound like we're incompetent. You're the intern. You represent my team. I stared at that line for a full minute, because it wasn't just insulting. It was a warning. He was telling me directly that if I made him look bad, he would remind everyone I was the intern. If anything went wrong, it would be my mess. So I did what people do when they're being cornered at work. I tightened my language. I wrote the vendor an email with no emotion and no blame. I said we could not grant production access until sign-off was complete, unless a documented exception was approved. I offered to schedule a short call with compliance to walk through the steps. The vendor didn't like it, but they didn't argue. And within 15 minutes, Dylan messaged me on chat. Why are you escalating? I told you to proceed. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for a second I wanted to type what I actually felt. You can't tell policy to change because you're impatient. Instead, I typed, I'm following the written onboarding controls. If you want an exception, legal and compliance need to approve it in writing. His reply, we'll talk after the meeting. That sentence hit like a door closing. Because we'll talk from someone like Dylan never meant clarify. It meant punish. He waited until the end of the day. He called me into a small conference room with glass walls, visible enough for people to notice, private enough that no one could hear. He didn't sit. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, like a guy in a movie trying to look calm while his ego boiled. You're making me look like I don't control my team, he said. I kept my face neutral. I'm trying to keep us in compliance. Dylan laughed once, short and sharp. Compliance? You're not compliance. Then he said the sentence that finally removed any doubt about who he was. Listen, you're an intern. I can end this internship with an email. Do you understand that? My stomach dropped, but my brain stayed strangely clear. Because threats are different from insults. Insults are for ego. Threats are for leverage. And once someone threatens your role, it means they've decided you're a problem they can't manage with jokes anymore. I looked at him and said, I understand my status. He nodded like he'd won. Then he walked out, leaving me in the glass box like an exhibit. On my way back to my desk, I noticed something small and technical that most people wouldn't have seen. My access to the vendor onboarding folder had changed. It wasn't gone completely. It was restricted. Certain subfolders, exception forms, approvals, audit templates, were now locked. Dylan had removed my ability to prove what I was doing. He wanted me blind. And in that moment, the unfairness stopped being emotional and became procedural. This wasn't office bullying anymore. This was someone interfering with controls. This was someone setting up a scapegoat. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. That night, I didn't rage text anyone. I didn't post. I didn't vent. I opened my notebook and wrote down, line by line, what had changed. Date, time, folder permissions, which subfolders were restricted, who had admin rights. Because in corporate life, the difference between he said, she said, and case closed is evidence with timestamps. Then I did the one thing Dylan didn't anticipate. I looked for the process outside his control. Most companies have them. Quiet channels where documentation lives, even when managers try to bury it. Ticketing systems, audit logs, change management, request approvals. So I pulled up the access request ticket Dylan had filed to speed up the vendor integration. And there it was. A note he'd typed himself. Need production access enabled by end of week. Approval pending, proceed anyway. He'd written it like it was normal, like bypassing controls was just the part of leadership. I took a screenshot. Then I exported the ticket history. Then I saved it with the same calm precision I'd used all week. And I understood something that made me both angry and relieved. If Dylan was this careless in the systems, it meant he was used to never being challenged. It meant he'd done this before. And it meant the company's real protection wasn't Dylan. It was the rules Dylan kept stepping over, rules that existed for the exact kind of manager who thought his title made him immune. By Thursday, my agenda item didn't feel dramatic anymore. It felt necessary. Because Dylan wasn't just disrespecting me. He was putting the company at risk and trying to trap me underneath it. Friday arrived. The weekly operations meeting was at 11. The attendees were the same as always. My team, Dylan, our director Mara, a finance partner, and someone from IT governance, who rarely spoke but always listened. Dylan walked in late again, coffee in hand, playing the part. He didn't greet me. He didn't say my name. He looked at the screen, then at me, and said loud enough for everyone, "All right, intern has the agenda." My heart thumped once, hard, but my voice stayed steady when I said, "Actually, I added one item." Dylan's smile tightened. "No, you didn't." Mara glanced up. "What item?" I clicked to the bottom of the agenda, and the words stared back at me like a fuse. Vendor onboarding control exception confirmation. Mara's expression changed slightly. Less curiosity, more alertness. Dylan tried to laugh. "We're not doing this." Not in front of everyone. I looked at Mara, not at him, and said, "I need clarity on whether we have documented legal and compliance approval for early production access. Because production access was requested, and the standard sign-off is not complete." The room didn't erupt. It did something worse for Dylan. It went quiet. And then Mara asked the question that didn't sound like emotion at all. It sounded like risk. "Dylan," she said, "did we grant production access early?" Dylan opened his mouth, and for the first time since I'd joined that company, he didn't know how to control the room. And then silence, the kind that means something's gone wrong. Mara didn't raise her voice. That's what made it terrifying. She just looked at Dylan the way you look at a crack in a windshield, quietly calculating how bad it could get if you hit a bump. "Did we grant production access early?" she repeated. Dylan laughed like the question itself was stupid. "We prepared for early access." "There's a difference." The finance partner, Elliot, shifted in his chair. The IT governance guy, Sam, didn't move at all. Sam was the kind of person who barely spoke. But when he did, meetings ended. Mara kept her eyes on Dylan. "Prepared how?" Dylan pointed his coffee cup at me without looking at me. "The intern's confused. He's reading policies like they're scripture. We didn't bypass anything. We accelerated the sequence." I felt my face heat, but I didn't speak, because if I spoke emotionally, I'd become what Dylan wanted me to be, a defensive intern. Mara didn't react to the insult. She said, "Nathan, forward me the thread you referenced." Hearing my name out loud in that room felt like air returning to my lungs. Dylan blinked. "Mara, come on, we don't need—" "I want the documentation," she said, still calm. "Now." My hands were steady when I opened my email. I forwarded the chain. My policy excerpt. My note asking for exception approval. Dylan's response instructing me to proceed without it. I didn't add commentary. I didn't underline anything. I just sent it. A minute passed. Then Mara's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced down, read, and her expression didn't change. But the room did. It's hard to describe how fast people stop laughing when a manager's arrogance turns into a written liability. Mara looked up. "Dylan, you told him to proceed without an exception form." Dylan shrugged like it was nothing. "Because we needed momentum. That's my job." Sam finally spoke. "Momentum doesn't override controls," he said flatly. Dylan turned toward Sam with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sam, this is ops, not," Sam cut him off. "If production access is granted prior to sign-off, that is a control exception. If there is no documented exception, that is a breach. Dylan's jaw tightened. You're assuming access was granted. Mara turned to Sam. Was it? Sam didn't answer immediately. He opened his laptop, clicked twice, and said, I can check in the access logs. Dylan's voice jumped half an octave. We're not doing log reviews in a weekly ops meeting, Mara said. We are now. And in that moment, I realized Dylan wasn't scared of being wrong. He was scared of evidence. But that was just the beginning. Sam's eyes moved across his screen. He didn't narrate, he didn't dramatize, he just read. Then he said, the vendor service account was created on Wednesday afternoon. Dylan leaned back like that proved him right. Created doesn't mean enable, Sam continued. The account was granted production credentials Thursday morning. Elliot's eyebrows rose. Thursday morning. Sam nodded. Thursday morning. And it was done under Dylan's admin approval. The room went completely still. Dylan's smile flickered like a dying light. That's not accurate. Sam didn't argue. He just rotated his laptop slightly toward Mara so she could see. Mara stared at the screen for a few seconds, then looked back at Dylan. Why did you approve production credentials before compliance sign-off? She asked. Dylan opened his mouth, closed it, then tried a different angle, one I'd been expecting since the moment he threatened my internship. He looked at me. This is on him, Dylan said, nodding toward my laptop like he was handing me a bomb. He's the one coordinating onboarding. He's the one who talks to the vendor. He's the one who knows the steps. If he thought we weren't ready, he shouldn't have done it. There it was. Clean. Simple. Predictable. He was trying to convert my job function into my liability. My stomach turned, but my brain stayed cold. Because I had already seen this movie. I didn't defend myself with feelings. I didn't say, that's unfair. I didn't say, he pressured me. I said, I didn't approve or provision credentials. I don't have the permissions to do that. Sam nodded once. That's true. Nathan doesn't have admin rights in that system. Dylan's eyes narrowed. Fine. But he was the one escalating. He was making it sound like we were incompetent. He's the intern. He doesn't understand business urgency. Mara didn't even glance at me. She stayed on Dylan. This isn't about urgency, she said. This is about you bypassing a control and putting it in writing. Dylan laughed again, but it sounded thinner now. So what? We backfill the form. Legal signs. Everyone moves on. Elliot finally spoke, careful but direct. That's not how audit works. If it's discovered later, it looks like concealment. Dylan snapped. It won't be discovered if people stop making a big deal out of it. The sentence hung in the air, and I watched Mara's face change, not into anger, but into certainty. Because Dylan had just revealed his real instinct. Not to fix risk, but to hide it. Mara stood up. When directors stand mid-meeting, it's never a good sign for someone. She looked at Dylan and said, We're ending this meeting. Sam, I want a log export and timeline. Elliot, loop in your controller. Dylan, do not touch anything related to this onboarding until we've reviewed it. Dylan lifted his hands like he was being wronged. Mara, you're overreacting. This is a non-issue. Mara said, If it's a non-issue, then you'll have no problem with an objective review. Then she turned to me. Nathan, come with me. I followed her out of the conference room into the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears. People at nearby desks pretended not to look, which meant they were absolutely looking. Mara walked fast, not angry fast, but purpose fast. She stopped at a small huddle room, closed the door, and finally, let a sliver of emotion into her voice. Did he threaten your internship? She asked. The question hit me harder than anything that had happened in the meeting, because it meant she wasn't just seeing the control breach. She was seeing the pattern. I hesitated for half a second, then said, Yes, Wednesday. After I asked for exception approval. Mara nodded once. Did he restrict your access to the onboarding folder after that? I swallowed. Yes, yesterday. Mara exhaled like she was putting pieces together. Okay, I need you to send me a written summary. Dates, what was said, and any proof you have. Keep it factual, no adjectives. I nodded because that was already how my brain worked. Then she said something that felt like a small crack of light in an ugly week. And for the record, you did the right thing. You weren't being difficult. You were doing your job. It wasn't a grand compliment, but it was a micro-catharsis so sharp I had to blink hard to keep my face steady. Because for the first time since I'd joined, someone in authority wasn't asking me to be quieter. They were asking me to be accurate. Mara opened the door and said, "Go write it." And Nathan? I looked up. She said, "If anyone calls you the intern today, they're going to regret it." I went back to my desk and started drafting the summary, like a report. Timeline, emails, access change, the ticket note Dylan had typed, the threat in the glass conference room. My hands didn't shake, but my stomach did, because I knew what was happening now. This wasn't a private correction. This was going to be formal, and formal processes have momentum of their own. I glanced over at Dylan's desk. He was sitting rigidly, jaw clenched, typing too hard, like he could pound his way out of consequences. Then I saw something else, something small that made my blood go cold. He was opening the shared onboarding folder, the one Mara had told him not to touch. And I realized Dylan wasn't going to accept a review. He was going to try to rewrite the past. And I didn't know it yet, but the next hour would turn my quiet agenda item into a full-blown office fire. I didn't stand up and accuse him. I didn't walk over and confront him. Because if Dylan was about to tamper with documentation, the worst thing I could do was announce that I'd noticed. People like him don't stop when they're caught. They get smarter. So I did the only thing that made sense in a real office. I created a record. I opened a new email to myself and typed a single line. At approximately late morning, Dylan opened the shared vendor onboarding folder after being instructed not to touch onboarding materials, pending review. Then I saved it as a draft. Because drafts, timestamp. They live on the server. They become evidence even if you never send them. My pulse was loud in my ears, but my hands were steady. That night, I stopped being the hero. I stopped thinking my job was to keep the peace. My job was to keep the facts. But that was just the beginning. Within minutes, my chat pinged. "Mara, are you available for a quick call?" I didn't reply with a story. I replied, "Yes." She called me into our office with the door closed. Sam from IT governance was already there. Laptop open, expression unreadable. Mara didn't waste time. "Sam pulled logs," she said. "We have a timeline. We're seeing changes in the onboarding folder from Dylan's account." My stomach tightened, so I wasn't imagining it. Mara looked at me. "Do you have anything that shows he was told not to touch it?" I nodded and forwarded the calendar invite update she'd sent after the meeting. Simple wording that instructed Dylan to pause all onboarding actions pending review. Sam added, "We also have a ticket history export. It includes his comment about proceeding without approval." Mara sat back, fingers steepled. "Okay, here's what's happening. Internal audit is being looped in, and legal is being notified because this touches regulated vendor access." The word legal landed like a weight, not because I feared it, but because I understood what it meant for Dylan. This wasn't an oops. This was now a corporate risk event. Mara's voice stayed calm. "Nathan, I need one more thing. Did you personally grant access at any point?" "No," I said. "I don't have permissions." Sam nodded. "Confirmed, he doesn't." Mara exhaled. "Good. Then we keep this clean." Then she said the sentence that made the room feel colder. "Dylan is claiming you misrepresented the policy and created panic." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so predictable it was insulting. "He's saying I did it?" I asked. Mara held my gaze. "He's implying you overstepped and caused confusion. He wants this framed as an intern misunderstanding process." And there it was. The entire reason he'd called me the intern for weeks. It wasn't just cruelty, it was pre-positioning. If the review came, he wanted the company to already see me as the unreliable variable. Mara leaned forward. He made 2 mistakes. He put his instruction in writing and he used his admin approval. That's what matters. I nodded slowly, but my chest still felt tight. Because I could already picture the next scene. Dylan, confident again in front of HR and legal, telling a story where he was the competent manager and I was the naive intern who made a small misunderstanding sound like a disaster. I'd seen people like him survive worse through charisma and framing. So I asked the only question that mattered. What happens now? Mara's answer was short. We lock the folder, we freeze access changes, we do a formal review, and we interview you. I nodded. Then Mara paused. And Nathan, do not speak to Dylan. Do not argue with him. If he approaches you, you keep it neutral, and you loop me in. I stood to leave, and as I reached the door, Mara added, one more thing. The meeting at 2, the vendor status meeting, still happens. Dylan was scheduled to lead it. I frowned. Is he still leading it? Mara's eyes flicked to Sam. Sam said, not if we can help it. And then silence, the kind that means the next hour is going to get messy. The next hour got messy. At 12:30, my access to the ticketing system changed. I still had login access, but several queues disappeared. The vendor onboarding queue, the compliance queue, the audit trail queue. It was like someone had pulled curtains shut. I didn't panic. I took screenshots. Then I opened Sam's contact in chat and typed, my queue access just changed. Vendor onboarding and compliance queues are missing. Sam responded a minute later. Noted. Keep screenshots. Do not attempt to regain access. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, because I knew exactly who was doing it. Dylan. He was trying to isolate me from the evidence, then claim I never had visibility in the first place. And if I had been younger or less stubborn, I might have doubted myself. But I had already printed the policy. I had already saved the email chain. I had already exported the ticket history. I had already documented the threat. So instead of spiraling, I did something simple. I wrote down the new timestamp, and I waited. At 1:15, Dylan appeared at my desk. He didn't walk like a manager. He walked like a guy trying to look calm while stepping over cracks. He leaned on the divider beside my monitor and lowered his voice. Hey, he said, can we talk? I kept my tone neutral. Mara asked me not to discuss this with you. Dylan's smile was tight. Of course she did. Because she's dramatic. I didn't react. He glanced around the office, then said, listen, you're smart, but you're out of your depth. You don't know how these things work. We fix it quietly. We move on. You don't want to be the intern who blew up a quarter. There it was again. Not my name. My role. My smallness. I looked at him and said, I'm not discussing it. Dylan's jaw flexed. If this becomes a formal issue, you don't get hired. You know that, right? You'll be the risky candidate. You'll be the one who couldn't stay in his lane. My stomach turned, but my voice stayed flat. I'm going back to work. Dylan leaned closer. Just forward me what you sent Mara. Let me see it. We'll align. And that was the moment I knew he was still trying to rewrite the past. He didn't want alignment. He wanted to know what I had so he could build a story around it. I said, no. Dylan straightened, eyes cold now. Okay, intern. He walked away, and I stared at my screen, feeling my heart hammer, because I knew something else now, too. He was going to do something desperate in the 2:00 meeting, because people like Dylan don't accept losing control. They create chaos to distract from evidence. I didn't know it yet, but the vendor status meeting was about to become the exact kind of public moment Dylan had been using to humiliate me. Except this time, the room had receipts. At 1:55, Mara sent a company-wide calendar update. Vendor status meeting. Updated host, Mara. 2 minutes later, Dylan's calendar disappeared from the invite list. And at 2:00 sharp, Mara walked into the conference room with Sam and a legal representative I'd never met. Quiet woman, black folder, no small talk. Dylan was already there. He stood up fast, smiling like he'd rehearsed it. Mara, he said, glad you're here. We can clear up the intern's confusion. Mara didn't sit. She said, Dylan, this meeting isn't about confusion. It's about control exceptions, access logs, and why you attempted to change records after being told to pause. Dylan's smile froze. Then he did exactly what I expected. He tried to perform. He turned to the room and said, Everyone, let's not overreact. This is a simple operational acceleration. We do it all the time. The legal rep opened her folder and spoke for the first time, voice calm, deadly. Do it all the time without documentation. Dylan's throat bobbed. Sam slid a printed timeline onto the table. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was clean. Account created, credentials granted, admin approver, folder access changes, ticket comment, time stamped. Dylan stared at it like it was written in a language he couldn't charm. And for the first time, he didn't have a joke. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. Mara looked at Dylan and said, Step outside with us. Dylan laughed once, hollow. This is insane. He stood anyway. As they walked out, the room stayed silent. No one spoke. The vendor reps on the video call looked confused, then slowly went still, like animals sensing danger. Mara paused at the door and looked back at the table. Nathan, she said, you can go back to your desk. I stood, walked out, and felt every eye follow me. Not with mockery, with something else. Recognition, maybe, or fear. Because everyone in that room now understood a truth they hate admitting at work. Titles don't protect you from logs, and the quiet person everyone underestimated. Sometimes he's the one holding the timeline. When I reached my desk, my email refreshed. A new meeting invite had appeared. Subject, HR interview today. Time, 3:30. Attendees, me, Mara, HR partner, legal. And in the notes section, one line, regarding vendor access exception and administrative conduct. My mouth went dry, because now it wasn't just Dylan's job on the line, it was my future too, and I had to walk into that interview and deliver facts like a scalpel. No anger, no drama, no holes, while Dylan tried to paint me as an intern who didn't understand the business. But I had one advantage. Everything he did while underestimating me. And the trail he left behind was so complete. It was almost generous. At 3:30, I walked into the HR interview with a notebook in my hand and a strange calm in my chest. Not confidence, not arrogance. The calm you get when you've already done the hard part, when you've told the truth, saved the proof, and accepted that whatever happens next is out of your control. Mara was there. So was HR. Rachel, the business partner for our department. And legal, the same quiet woman with the black folder. Sam joined by video. Laptop camera pointed at a blank wall like he didn't want the drama on record. Dylan wasn't in the room. That mattered more than I expected. Rachel started the way HR always starts, measured and careful. Nathan, we're conducting a fact-finding discussion regarding the vendor onboarding, exception, and subsequent access and documentation changes. We want you to walk us through what happened. Keep it chronological. Keep it factual. I nodded. I didn't talk about how it felt to be called the intern. I didn't talk about humiliation. I didn't talk about ego. I talked about actions. I explained the vendor request for early production access, the onboarding controls, the policy clause requiring an exception form approved by legal and compliance. My email to Dylan, his response instructing me to proceed without the exception. I stopped at each point where I had documentation and offered it like it was routine. Email chain, ticket export, screenshot of queue access being removed, timestamp note about folder access being restricted, the threat in the glass conference room, written down the same day. Rachel asked, Did Dylan ever directly instruct you to conceal anything? I paused, then said, He said it wouldn't be discovered if people stopped making a big deal out of it. I didn't embellish. I didn't assign motives. I just repeated the words. The legal rep made a small note on her pad. Mara didn't interrupt. She just listened with her jaw set, like each detail confirmed what she'd already suspected. Rachel asked, "Did you grant any access yourself?" "No," I said. "I don't have the permissions." Sam's voice came through the speaker, flat and certain. "Confirmed. He does not have the access rights to provision or approve production credentials." Rachel nodded and flipped a page. "And after the Friday meeting, you observed Dylan accessing onboarding materials after being instructed not to?" "Yes," I said. I drafted a timestamp note to myself, and I reported the Q access changes to Sam. The legal rep looked up for the first time and said calmly, "You did the right thing." It was a small sentence, but it hit like a release. Because for an entire week, Dylan had tried to make me feel like following policy was childish. Now the adults in the room were saying the opposite. Rachel closed her notebook. "Okay, we have what we need. Nathan will follow up if anything else comes up. For now, continue working as normal. And if anyone contacts you about this, you refer them to me." I stood to leave, and Mara walked out with me into the hallway. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. But as we passed the open office, she stopped near my desk and looked at me directly. "You're doing fine," she said. "Go breathe." I sat down, stared at my inbox, and felt something I hadn't felt since the internship started. Not pride, space, like I had stopped shrinking. At 4:15, Dylan pinged me on chat, just his name, and a message that read, "Come to the small conference room. Now." I didn't answer. I took a screenshot. Then I forwarded it to Rachel in HR and said, "Dylan is attempting to meet privately after I was instructed not to discuss this." I didn't feel heroic when I sent it. I felt tired. Because the pattern was obvious now. When he couldn't control the facts, he tried to control the room. At 4:30, Dylan walked out of a meeting room down the hall, with Rachel and the legal rep behind him. He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. He looked pale, like someone had finally shown him a mirror he couldn't talk his way out of. He saw me at my desk, and his eyes narrowed, then softened into something like calculation, like he was trying to decide if intimidation still worked. He started walking toward me. Rachel stepped slightly in his path without making it dramatic. "Dylan," she said, "you're done for the day. Please return your laptop and badge." His mouth opened. No sound came out. Then he smiled, a thin, performative smile that didn't convince anyone. "This is insane," he said loud enough for nearby desks to hear. "Over an intern misunderstanding process." The legal rep didn't raise her voice. She just said, "This is not about misunderstanding. This is about documented instruction to bypass controls, administrative approval without sign-off, and retaliatory access changes." Dylan's smile collapsed. He tried again. Different angle. "You're going to fire me because the intern got nervous?" Rachel held her tone steady. "You are being separated due to policy violations and conduct. This decision is final." And there it was. No debate, no performance, no negotiation. Dylan stood there for a beat, then looked around like he was searching for an ally in the room. Someone to laugh with him. Someone to validate him. Someone to make it feel like he was still the manager. Nobody moved, nobody laughed. Because logs don't care who you are. At a few minutes before 5 o'clock, security arrived. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just present. Dylan handed over his badge and laptop like his hands didn't quite belong to him. He walked out the same door he'd used all week to walk into meetings and call me intern. Only this time, he didn't have an audience. He didn't have control. He didn't even have a story. He was gone by 5 o'clock, and the office didn't cheer. It just exhaled. At 5:10, Mara called me into her office one last time. She shut the door and sat down like she'd aged a year and a day. "Internal audit is documenting it as a control exception with corrective actions," she said. "Legal is handling the vendor disclosure. HR is documenting the retaliation." I nodded. "Understood." Mara stared at her desk for a second, then looked up. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I should have noticed the intern thing sooner. I should have shut it down." I didn't know what to say, so I said the truth. I didn't want special treatment. I just wanted to do the job without being used as a shield. Mara nodded slowly. That's exactly why I'm doing something now. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It wasn't a dramatic contract. It wasn't a cinematic offer letter. It was a conversion request. Full-time. Operations risk analyst. Effective the next pay period. With a note that read, demonstrated strong controls judgment under pressure. Mara said, you already do the work. The title is catching up. I stared at the paper, and the satisfaction that hit me wasn't revenge. It was relief. Because the ending wasn't me winning. The ending was me being seen accurately. I walked out of her office, packed my bag, and left the building in the calm light of early evening. Nobody called me the intern on the way out. Not because they were suddenly kind. Because they had watched what happened when someone treated a title like a weapon and documentation like a joke. And I realized something simple, something that felt almost peaceful. I didn't need to be louder. I didn't need to be sharper. I just needed to stop letting people rewrite who I was. After that week, my name stopped being a punchline. It started being what it should have been from the beginning. My name,